you have sweaty balls or volleyball netty balls? It's time to make them ready balls. The Manscaped.com Lawnmower 3.0 will do the job and clean your knob with its patented no-nick head, so your head will function as desired. Enter promo code Wrestling Future for a generous 20% discount. That's enter Wrestling Future for a 20% discount. Manscaped.com and Wrestling with the Future, going balls to the walls with Manscaped.com and the Lawnmower 3.0. Your balls will thank you, and so will we. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special Part 2 episode of Married to the Mob. We're joined once again by George Anastasia. He is a Pulitzer Prize nominated author, a writer, expert. You call it expert, George, or historian? What do you prefer? Expert?
I think expert's a bit of a stretch. Yeah, probably historian's better.
Historian. He is a mafia historian. He's also a really cool cat to have in your corner if you're looking for a good cup of French coffee. I think we've established that with Dan last time. But George Anastasia is back to talk life in and out of the mob. We're going to talk about his past and present works. And joining me in this conversation is himself, the Happy Haberdasher, the smartest guy in the room. I have to say that. I'm contractually obligated. Dan the Man Sebastiano. Welcome. And how you doing, Danny?
Oh, looking forward to this conversation.
Good. George, how are you, brother?
I'm doing well, thank you. Doing very well.
Good. Well, I'll tell you what. I told you off the air. I'll say it to our friends. George Anastasia's episode, the last episode we did, in fact, the first episode we did with George, garnered on Spotify alone more than 27,000 listens. That's verified. That's just on Spotify. I don't know what iTunes and iHeart did or Google Play or any of those others, but holy crap. That was a super episode. It's going to be right up there with the episode that Dan and I just did with the legendary Dominic DeNucci, another well-known Italian. How about that one, Dan?
We're everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Guys, I tell you what, man, you guys, like, you reproduce like bunny rabbits. I was saying you guys like I'm not a gavone myself. Of course I am. Look at me. With this face, come on. So, George, when last we left off, we had a bit of fun talking about some of the nicknames and some of the film influence from our friends and our friends in the family. But I actually got an email from someone who wanted to know if you knew whether Anthony Fat Tony Salerno was involved in the Kennedy assassination and what happened to Nicky the Crow Caramandi.
Last question first. Nick Caramandi is still living somewhere in Middle America. He went into the witness security program, and I talk to him occasionally. If he could come back to South Philly and undo everything he did, he would do it in a minute. What I know is he's living in a trailer park somewhere out there, and is, when he was a wise guy, I think it was the high point of his life, and he misses that. But
yeah, I'm sure.
I mean, Nick must be in his 80s now. He's in really good health. So yeah, I talk to him once in a while, but he's out there. In terms of,
there's an interesting connection between that world, George, and the world that Dan and I come from in professional wrestling and MMA, in that a lot of times these guys don't know how to retire. They don't know what to do with themselves when they can't do what they used to do. Is that a problem, not just for Nick Caramandi or the Crow, as they call him, but is that a problem widespread amongst the wise guys?
I think it is for a lot of guys from Caramandi's generation. Now he's in his 80s now. That was their life, and they've lost that, and they can never go back to that. I think some of these younger guys that have cooperated and disappeared, they know how to make the change. Like Phil Leonetti, for example, is living a really good life. He's changed his whole approach. He's a businessman.
Mhm.
He's doing very well. So some guys can't, and some guys, you know, I think it's a psychological thing.
George, is there a stigma with these guys? Those that still use their legal name rather than Americanizing it. Phil Leonetti, I'm assuming is still Philip Leonetti.
Well, I don't know. I think he went into Woodstock. He's probably got a different name. I mean, that's
Okay.
the only way they can disappear. They get a whole new identity. So
Yeah.
it may still be an Italian name, but it's not going to be Phil Leonetti.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was getting at. Is
I'll tell
are there guys, old school guys that are, I don't know what the word is, Dan. I'm looking for hesitant, maybe, or resistant to changing their heritage. You know where I'm going, Dan?
Yeah, you're saying. I mean, obviously, someone like Phil Leonetti, he's going to keep an Italian name, might be Carboni or something like that. Whereas he's not going to go into witness protection and become an O'Connor or a Muhammad or something like that.
Oh yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they try to stay as close as they can to who they were. For example, I would imagine, I don't know what his new name is, but I'll bet you his first name is still Phil. I mean, that's what they're used to, and that's what you respond to. So it's difficult to change that kind of stuff around and not get tripped up. So,
yeah. Dan, go ahead and have at it.
If I can chime in, would it be not uncommon to maybe take a middle name, like Philip as a middle name? Because I know a lot of people that go by their middle name. That way his name can be harder to look up, but he can still be called Phil.
Yeah, and the other reason that you might want to do that is, if you're in a restaurant, for example, and somebody sees you who doesn't know you're in hiding, they go, "Hey, Phil, how you doing?" And if you were somebody else, to say, "What do you mean, Phil? Your name is Joe," that kind of thing. So it's all about security. That's part of it.
That's a good point.
And part of it is about being comfortable. And
then let me ask you to expand on that. Then one of the things we talked about, the Hollywood portrayal of organized crime. There must have been 100 different action movies in the last couple decades where the premise is somebody's in witness protection and the mob finds him and then he's got to fight his way. Is that, I understand that's obviously not as action filled, but is it as common, or should I say relatively common, for people in WITSEC to be discovered because of how deep the pockets go with some of these families?
That's a good question. Then guys in WITSEC who have left and come back, there's been examples, they've been killed. If there's a guy in WITSEC who gets killed, we're not going to hear about it because the feds don't want people to know that.
Right.
WITSEC has this reputation that it's an umbrella, you're covered, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So somebody's got a new identity and he gets whacked somewhere. The police report from wherever he is going to be under his new identity. We're not going to know about it. And the feds are not going to make a point of saying, "Oh, we just lost a guy." So I think it probably happens. I don't think it happens often, but I think even when it does happen, we're not going to hear about it.
George, can you?
There was a guy in Philly named Mike Palmer who was living out in the Midwest somewhere and mysteriously got run over by a train. It sounded like a hit. And I learned about it only because his family, who remained in the area, was upset about it. That's the only quasi example I know of a guy in the program who was killed. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you then, George, a guy like Sammy Gravano, who initially refused protection and then accepted it and then ended up getting busted. A guy like that, who's clearly, you can't really hide that face. I mean, you can distort it to some degree, but I mean, he is who he is. He's a very distinctive character. Sammy the Bull. And I mean that, and literally and figuratively, he's a character, this guy. Another guy that you don't know whether what's coming out of his mouth is accurate, genuine, bullshit, or what it is. Let's talk about a guy like that.
Well, I mean, Sammy Gravano is a good example of what you were talking about. There's a guy who went into the program but couldn't stop being Sammy the Bull. I mean, that's who he was. And so when they relocated him to Phoenix, he and his son got involved in an ecstasy operation. He gets indicted and he gets sent back to jail. I mean, he's out again now, but this was a guy who, that's who he was, and he couldn't stop being Sammy the Bull. Other guys...
Is there a concern about that, Jordan? You mentioned the Crow a little earlier being of a certain age bracket, and guys of this, the what they would call the wise guy generation, guys in their late 70s, early 80s, that's their whole life. It's all they have ever known. A guy like Sammy, what does he do? I mean, he can try to go legit, but at some point, I mean, we all know it. I mean, I hate to be judgmental, but a guy like Sammy the Bull, he only really has one choice in life,
Well, I mean, yeah. What's your skill set? What are you good at?
That's what I'm getting at.
So where are you going to go if your skill is to be an extortionist and a thug and a murderer, and you're let out of jail? What are you supposed to do with any of that?
Exactly.
See, some guys can rechannel. Some guys can rechannel the energy and take it in a different direction. Some guys can't.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, it was funny. We were talking about, you mentioned the Crow and the Bull. Some of the feedback we got from the show was the discussion we had on nicknames, and something I was hoping we could touch on last week that we didn't really get much time to touch on. Obviously, there's a lot of high-profile nicknames, and we talked about the origin. I mean, I mentioned I'm Italian. If I go to a family reunion and there's 20 people there, 18 of them have nicknames. I understand the point, but the question that got brought up a lot is, can you think of any examples of people who had nicknames that absolutely hated them, and the other side being people who loved them for one reason or another? I mean, to the point of where, you sometimes you see in the mob movies, if you call me pretty boy to my face, I'll kill you. Like, are there?
Well,
I wish the hell I'd have asked that damn question.
One of the guys we've earlier mentioned is Phil Leonetti. His nickname was Crazy Phil. He hated that nickname, but his uncle, Mickey Scarfo, said, "Wow, you're crazy. That's a great nickname for what you're about." So, yeah, I mean, there are guys who are, they don't, Little Nicky. Nobody ever called him Little Nicky to his face.
Yeah, not to his face. No.
Short in stature, but that's what he was known as. So, yeah, some of the guys I think it gives them status, gives them a little bit of audacity. Other guys, no. The other thing about nicknames, I think we talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago. You grew up in South Philadelphia, everybody's got a nickname. I had an uncle Tony. Now there are 8 million Anthonys in South Philly.
Yeah.
When he was growing up, he was a short order cook at a restaurant called Tartak's. Around the neighborhood, it was called Tony Tartak. I mean, because there were so many other Tonys. Has nothing to do with being a gangster. It has to do with another
exactly.
Interesting. There was an FBI report in New York when the different families in New York were proposing guys to get made. They would have to pass the names around to the other families. Do you know anything bad about this guy? Have you heard anything negative about him? Should we make him a part of our family? Right. And some of the comments that came back from the other families was, Joe Bada Bing, who the hell put the nicknames in? We don't know these guys by their real names. What's his nickname? That's the only way we're going to know who he is. So yeah, it plays a role a lot of different ways.
Well, then yeah. Continuing with the nickname question, I'm curious. Obviously, Fat Tony or Scarface. There's nicknames that have popped up more than once through the history of organized crime. Is there some kind of unwritten rule on like how long somebody has to be gone, or what kind of or distance you have to have in order to have two people with the same nickname?
No, I don't think so. I mean, especially if you start to look at nicknames with guys named Tony. I would bet you there are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Fat Tonys throughout the underworld. That's just what it is.
Well, we actually had a question about a Tony at the beginning of the show. Someone wants to know, and we had a couple of emails regarding your first appearance, and one of them regarded, of course, Nicky the Crow, and the gentleman named Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. Right. His involvement or lack thereof in either the Kennedy assassination or his involvement, I guess, with the Sam Giancana and that crew.
Well, I mean, I know a little bit about the Kennedy assassination because I teach a course on organized crime, and it's one of the things we get involved in. I've never heard Salerno's name linked to that. I've heard Sam Giancana from Chicago, Johnny Roselli, Handsome Johnny from LA, Santo Trafficante from Tampa, Sam Giancana from Chicago, and Carlos Marcello from New Orleans. Historically, if you look into it, most people point the fingers at those guys. They were part of, and at one point, apparently, they were working hand in hand with the CIA. This is when Castro had driven the mob out of Cuba, shut down all their casinos, and then we had Kennedy was the president, and the Bay of Pigs were going to invade Cuba, and the mob was behind the CIA with that because they're going to get the casinos back. The Bay of Pigs was a fiasco, and after that, they started pointing fingers at one another, and a lot of people think one of the reasons Kennedy was killed was over that whole situation.
Well,
Yeah.
Let me ask, out of curiosity, Angelo will tell you, we've had discussions on the show before. I usually get to play the straight man to the conspiracy. In this case, I see why a lot of people raise an eyebrow. Just on a scale of, say, 0 to 100, what's the percentage chance that the official narrative that Oswald worked alone is true?
30, 25, 30%. I mean, look at the
That's actually higher than I thought you would say.
How does that single bullet thing work? One bullet
Yeah.
can all damage? I mean, it's ridiculous. There's always an outside chance but everything that I've read and trying to study it, there were a lot more people and a lot more parts in play when it all went down.
We should also point out that the brainchild behind that gem was a Philadelphia senator named Arlen Specter.
Exactly. That's the single bullet guy.
We also had a couple of emails, George.
Yeah.
One of them was a very interesting email. They wanted to know how much involvement do mob lawyers, and they threw a bunch of names out. Some of them I already knew, and some I had to be refreshed.
Right.
How much involvement do mob lawyers have before or after the fact in representing their clients, quote unquote clients? People like Bruce Cutler, Robert Simone, Salvatore Avina. What was the other name they gave me? Anthony Peruto. I believe that was Anthony Peruto. Okay. Yes, sir. So let's talk about, there's always been this kind of sordid history / association between mobsters and their attorneys.
Yeah, and I think there have been instances where attorneys have crossed the line and become part of the organization rather than being the attorney.
And I think that's what the questioner is going for.
And I think Bobby Simone was an example of that. And Bobby Simone ended up going to jail because of that. He got involved in the middle of the Penn's Landing extortion, and he got convicted. And Bobby was an excellent lawyer, but Bobby also would. There was a great line about Bobby Simone when he died. He said, supposedly once said, 90% of my money I spent on gambling and women, and the other 10% I wasted. So, Bobby liked to live large. Bobby liked to live large, and he was an excellent lawyer, but he also got jammed up in a lot of things because he liked to gamble and because he ended up being more than just Nicky Scarfo's lawyer. And unfortunately, it worked.
And I want to pursue that line of questioning because there are, he's certainly not the first attorney to do time after representing a client. My recollection of the Gotti trial was that shortly thereafter, perhaps a couple of years after, Bruce Cutler ended up being convicted of jury tampering or attempted jury tampering. John Gotti's attorney, Bruce Cutler, went to jail.
I don't know if Cutler was ever convicted of that. I know Cutler was another guy who became the champion for his client, but I don't know that Bruce ever crossed that line. Bruce was a very dramatic attorney, and he represented a gangster here in Philadelphia in a racketeering trial, and didn't come off quite as strongly as he had in New York. I don't know that Cutler ever crossed that line and got jammed up in terms of crime. Salavino, on the other hand, Salavino was indicted in a big racketeering case against John Stanfa, but he went to trial and he beat the case. He was acquitted.
Now, John Stanfa was the, as we mentioned on the last show, was the interim boss in Philadelphia. He was represented by an attorney named Salvatore Avina from, I believe, Camden, New Jersey.
Correct. Yeah, right down on Market Street.
Yeah.
And Avina's law office was bugged by the FBI. I
was just going to go there. So let's talk about that. The FBI is a government organization, but they don't necessarily play by the same rules that a lot of people do. And we know that they don't. So let's just call a spade a spade. Sometimes you got to break the law to make the law. So, and they did, as far as I'm concerned, they did the right thing. They got the information they needed. to convict the bad guy. So is that a bad thing for the FBI to break into a guy's office and bug his everyday daily life?
Well, I think it depends on how you go about doing that. In fact, I wrote a book about this called The Goodfellow Tapes. The FBI had to go in front of a judge and say, we believe that John Stanfa, the mob boss, is holding mob meetings in his lawyer's office, and he's hiding behind lawyer-client privilege. And we want to bug the office so we can hear what's going on. And the way the system works is it's not like, oh, okay, go do it. First, you got to present, here's why we believe, and you get approval to do it for 30 days. And then in 30 days, you have to go back in front of the judge and say, here's what we're finding. We want to do another 30 days. Now, that went on for more than 2 years.
Yeah.
So and they constantly went in front of the judge and said, here's what we picked up on tape. Here's what's being said. And that's one of the reasons that whole John Stanfa, Joey Merlino war is so well documented, because every time something happened, these guys are back in Avina's office talking about it. The other fascinating thing in that tape is, I mean, some of this stuff you can't make up any better than it is. As a writer, sometimes I look to heaven and say, thank you, Jesus. Avina's in his office one day having a meeting with Tony Buck Piccolo, who's the consigliere of the family right there. And they're talking about FBI surveillance, FBI bugs, cooperating witnesses. You got to be careful who you talk to. You never know. Be careful when you're on the phone. You never know who's listening. And Avina says, you know what, Tony, you're absolutely right. I had an electronic expert come in over the weekend, and he swept this entire suite of offices. Cost me $500. Piccolo said, Sal, that's money well spent. Meanwhile, the tapes are just rolling and picking up all the time. It's one of them moments where you say, there it is. And the thing about
that's
tapes,
crazy.
Tapes are such great pieces of evidence because you can't cross-examine a tape. If you got Jackson on tape talking about how we're going to get this guy here and give him on the back of the head, how do you cross-examine that tape?
Well, along those lines, let's take another guy, John Gotti, the Ravenite Social Club.
Right, as another example.
Now, there was an elderly woman that lived, her apartment, I believe, was just above the social club. Now, how did they gain access to this elderly woman's apartment to be able to bug Gotti's social club, George?
Well, Gotti was constantly under surveillance, and the Ravenite was constantly being watched. And I think the FBI, over the course of time, saw that periodically Gotti would disappear upstairs with some other people. And this would be when the elderly woman was out. So they had use of her apartment. Again, the FBI went in front of a judge, said, here's what we believe, got authorization, and they bugged that apartment. And again, it's the same thing. Gotti's own words buried him in that trial. It was
God, did they? Yeah.
Well,
so electronic surveillance is a very, very big tool in the war on organized crime.
Oh, huge.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
With the Gotti case was pretty high profile at the time for some of it, and it's been popped up before with the FBI surveillance, especially going back to like the 70s, where the public and juries and all had to be educated on mob slang. I remember where they talked about, like, we're going to play this tape for you. Here's what the word whack means. Here's what this means. Here's what that means. I'm curious, one, if you could maybe expand on that, and two, did language evolve because they knew they needed new code words? Like you mentioned before, the chin comment, on the last episode we did. Did if you could expand on learning the language, how law enforcement had to do that, and then if the language evolved because of the fact that people knew what you were saying now.
I taught you well, young squire.
The more law enforcement listened, the better they were in interpreting what these guys were talking about. And so any slang phrases or language, they would pick that up. What Gotti and others in New York started to do was what they call walk talks. They weren't going to meet in a room. They were going to take a walk around the block because they figured they're less likely to be picked up electronically if you're out in the open air walking around the block, that kind of stuff. And as we mentioned before, with Gigante, you could never mention his name. He just said that you rub your chin and say, this guy wants that. And that he was very paranoid about tapes because tapes are so devastating. In terms of how the language evolved, I mean, the wise guys are always talking about the feds. You got to be careful about the FBI, but they won't say the FBI. They'll say the eyeballs, or these guys, or those guys, that kind of thing. It's kind of common knowledge in the underworld what they're talking about. They don't want to say it outright because they don't want to in any way indicate that they're guilty of anything. I mean, why would you worry about the FBI if you're not doing
Sure.
anything? That kind of thing.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Dan, follow up.
Well, then one of the things, if I can have you expand on that a bit, is tradition too. Like you mentioned, where they didn't want to mention the FBI. There's the old tradition in theater, like stage production, where you never say the word Hamlet during the play or during the production. Was there words like FBI or cop or something that were just considered bad luck, regardless of what you were talking about?
No, I think most guys were smart enough to realize you just don't even make those kind of discussions because you're going to call attention to yourself if there's a tape. But no, there was no edict. And quite frankly, then some of these guys weren't smart enough to realize any of that anyway. Some of them just didn't care, and some of them weren't sophisticated enough to be cognizant of any of that. So, it runs the gamut.
Well, if I can, one final follow up with that.
Take time, Dan.
Was there ever the idea, you just mentioned how a lot of them didn't understand? Was there ever the idea of counter surveillance, like with people like, say, Pablo Escobar was famous for having fake conversations to mislead law enforcement? Was there incidents where they, like, we suspect we're being bugged, so let's basically discuss something that's not real to throw law enforcement off what we're actually doing?
I suspect there were. I can't think of any specific example, but I think if somebody thinks a phone is bugged, they're going to get on that phone and say something contrary to what the reality is. And that is in part to exonerate themselves, in part to throw the FBI off course so they go in another direction. It's a question of knowing. If you know that a phone is bugged, then you can play the reverse game on these guys. And if you know a room is bugged, or sometimes they'll bug a car, and if you get word of that,
Interesting stuff. Interesting. Talking about language, just like in pro wrestling, we have our own language. It's called Carney. I'm assuming, based on the history and based on the conversations we've had, that the mob has their own language as well. They've got some words, and I wrote a couple of these words. Imagine that, me writing some shit down. Let's talk about what is a vig or vigorish. Tell people what a vig or vigorish is.
That's the interest on a loan shark loan. I mean, that's another thing people don't realize. How Nicky Crow told me that when I first met him. There's nothing better than shark money. And I said, what do you mean, Nicky? He said, well, a guy owes me 10 grand and he can't pay, and I'm a bookmaker. I'll send him to a loan shark, he'll borrow the money, and he borrows the 10 grand at 3 points for 10 weeks. And the vig is the 3 points. It's 300 a week. And after 10 weeks, he's paid 3,000 in interest and still owes the 10. And you extend it to another 10 weeks and another 10 weeks. And at the end of a year, the guy's paid 15.6 in interest and still owes you the 10. And you've taken the 15.6 and put it on a street at 3 points. The vig is the 3 points. It's the interest you charge on a loan.
It's interesting stuff. Unless you live on the East Coast, if you live in Middle America, you probably don't know what any of this stuff means. George, tell everybody what a street number is.
The street number, it's the lottery, but it's the street number, and that it pays off a little bit better than state lottery, and it's usually based on the pari-mutuel payoff at a given racetrack on any given day. And
exactly.
So that way nobody can control what the number is going to be. One of the things people don't realize is these are gangsters, these are crooks. When they're running a gambling operation, they want it to be legit. They don't want anybody playing with anything because it's their business and the credibility of their business. A bettor's got to know he's going to get an honest shot. So nobody wants to fix anything.
Now, my favorite word, George, fugazi. What's a fugazi?
Fugazi. That was Donnie Brasco. They had that. That was great.
Yes, sir.
A fugazi is something that's fake. Remember when Brasco was a piece of jewelry? Yeah, that's a fugazi. Anything that's fake is a fugazi.
Exactly. I love that. So one of the things, one of the hot buttons that we had on the last episode were when you and I were speaking about some of the photos that were behind me on that episode. There was a lot of interest from people in how certain mobsters met their final demise.
Right.
We know that Paul Castellano, of course, was assassinated, Angelo Bruno. But a lot of the older school guys lived to be, into their 80s and 90s. Talking about people like, God, what was it? Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Benny Bugsy Siegel wasn't so lucky, but there's certainly guys like Lucky Luciano who lived very into his late 70s, early 80s for as far as I know, at least into his 80s.
He was deported to Italy, but yeah, he lived. He died of natural causes. So did Carlo Gambino. More recently, Carlo Gambino.
And we had questions along those lines of what happened to these, the difference between the old school guys and the guys of, say, the 60s and 70s, all of whom seemed to meet really gruesome deaths.
Well, if you look at Philadelphia from Bruno going forward,
Bruno was a bloodbath.
Bruno was killed. Phil Tester was killed. Scarfo died in prison doing life. John Stanfa serving life. So I mean, why would you want to be the boss? I mean, you want to end up dead or in jail.
Well, yeah, you mentioned on the last show, Angelo Bruno was boss for 20-something years, and John Gotti was boss for 5.
Yeah, that's the difference. It's your management style.
It was really profound, something like that, kind of like it's a head scratcher for sure. But it makes you think, what were they doing right back then? Well, I think what they did right was they kept to what they knew, and largely what they knew was, loan sharking, gambling, women. They stayed away from, largely for the most part, stayed away from, narcotics. I love that line, in Godfather, blood is a big expense, and so there wasn't a lot of that. Not until Nicky Scarfo came, and you and I talked about it, George, being the bloodiest 3 years in Philly mob history, with some 22, 23 people, meeting really, gruesome deaths.
It was carnage. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a bloodbath. There was a lot of expense back in the day.
Yeah, and the other thing that did was it brought law enforcement down on these guys. I mean, one of the reasons Angelo Bruno was able to operate for 21 years is violence was at a minimum. And so if he's taking bets or he's loaning money, by and large, nobody cares. When bodies started dropping in the Scarfo era, people were upset and law enforcement had to react. So you had to, the cops.
Well, George, how much of that was the fact that Angelo Bruno, for all intents and purposes, is described as a really nice guy? How much does the nice guy factor? I mean, as much as a nice guy can be the mafia boss, but
No, Angelo, you're right about that. Some of it is a reflection of the personality. Angelo Bruno was a very avuncular. People in the neighborhood loved him, and he understood who he was, and he understood where he fit in the scheme of things. And the idea was make money, not headlines. Don't call attention to yourself. Scarfo had his history was he was banished to Atlantic City when there was nothing to take care of down there. He was the mob caretaker in Atlantic City, nothing to take care of. And then casino gambling comes along. He's aligned with Phil Tester. Phil Tester gets killed, and all of a sudden Scarfo's the boss. Now he's grabbing with both fists. He's never had money. Now he's on top, and it turned the whole organization upside down. Absolutely.
Well, his involvement in Atlantic City was a critical turning point for mob life in Philadelphia, for sure. Atlantic City was never the same. It still isn't the same today as a result of it. The unions are all but, they're largely mob free. I'll say that. I'm not going to say they're mob free, but they're largely mob free. But what he did in Atlantic City was really paint with a broad brush, and unfortunately, guys like me who worked there at the time, we had to pay our tribute to the boss by way of our paycheck, because we paid some hefty dues, brother. I got news for you. I was a member of Local 54.
Well, he got his hooks to Local 54. He was very close with Frank Gerace, who headed that union. And in the early days of casino gambling, only Scarfo was getting a big cut from everything that was happening there. And
Yeah.
you know what else it did? It gave him eyes and ears on the floor of each casino. If you remember back then, you would know poker was illegal, but there could there'd be a poker game up on the 7th floor in a room. You want to get a high roller up there, you get him up there. If he wants to play
God,
poker, we got a game for you. Now, another thing I was always fascinated with, this is kind of the hypocrisy of all of this. Sports betting was illegal for a long time down there, right? It's only recently. Yeah. So the casinos would have a heavyweight boxing match or a Super Bowl Sunday. They would bring in all the high rollers, comp them because they wanted them to play in the casino. But these guys are serious gamblers. Are they? They don't have a bet on the boxing match. They don't have a bet on the Super Bowl. Well, of course they do. But who are they going to place the bet with? Not with the casino because it's illegal. So that was kind of the hypocrisy of all this. You're bringing all of these guys in. It was like a ready market for the mob. Super Bowl Sunday, big screen TVs in the casino, blah, blah, blah. You want to bet? Here, I'll go see this guy.
And they had been doing in Las Vegas, George, they've been doing sports book for decades in Las Vegas. Finally, New Jersey has a sports book. But now, let's talk about in that line, George. Let's talk about the mob influence at Philadelphia and New Jersey area racetracks. There was something that was instituted many, many years ago called OTB. Tell everyone what OTB is.
It's off-track betting.
Yes, sir.
You have those different little stores, for want of a better word. You go there and place bets on and the races are, the videotapes of the races are there. And the thing is, the timing of all of that. You can't fool around with the timing of all of that. That's how you can rig things.
Yeah.
In terms of, I'm watching a race, but it really happened 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly.
I already know who won that race. I'm going to put my bet down. That's where you can play with it.
Sure. Absolutely.
The guy I wrote about in The Last Gangster, for a while worked at the Atlantic City racetrack. And he was involved in the whole ring that was doping the horses. And so, they would dope up 3 or 4 horses. So then there's only 2 or 3 left. You know who to put your trifecta, who to bet with.
Exactly. And that's why I mentioned off-track betting. It was highly scrutinized at the time. It was let to flourish and operate, but the mob had their hand all over that stuff. Big time. There are 2 books behind me, George. Gotti's Rules and The Last Gangster. Let's talk about the inspiration for The Last Gangster.
That was Ronnie Previty. Ronnie Previty, one of the more fascinating wise guys I ever met in my life. Former Philadelphia cop. Ended up in Hamilton, New Jersey, which is where he grew up, there in Southwest Philly. Got involved first as a freelance gangster and eventually became part of John Stanfa's crime family. Major player. One of the more erudite guys I've ever talked to in terms of the mob, and well-read. And he was Ronnie used to say, some guys are specialists. I'm a general practitioner. I do it all. And he had his hand and everything. Only thing he said he had never done, and I believe this is true, he said, I never murdered anybody. But I said I would beat somebody to the edge of their life, but I never murdered anybody because murder never goes away. That's a crime that the statute never runs on, and you always got to answer for that.
There have been a number of people, Daniel, that wore the badge and decided that the money was better on the other side. Talk about that, Dan. Talk about some of the guys from law enforcement that went over to wear the pinstripe suit and then eventually wearing the big stripe.
Well, you had obviously you had law enforcement on the take, both active and financially. People stories of obviously cops being paid to look the other way, certain people being paid to handle evidence, and then some cops that moonlighted as enforcers. However, I'm curious, this kind of ties back into what you were talking about earlier with the language and the nicknames and the slang. The original FBI reports used to refer to law enforcement being involved in the waste management business. I was wondering if you could expand on what that meant exactly.
Waste management, legitimate waste management, trash companies, that kind of stuff. I mean,
waste management was a term for or maybe the garbage business, perhaps they would call it. It was that was slang for organized crime, correct?
Yeah, sanitation.
I mean,
sanitation.
That was, yeah. I mean, if law enforcement wanted to talk negatively, that's what they would say. These guys are in the garbage business. These guys are
Okay.
garbage, that kind of stuff. I thought you meant like, I mean, solid waste management. I mean, not for nothing was Tony Soprano a solid waste management consultant. I mean, the mob in New Jersey has always been involved in the trash business.
Well,
I
they
mean,
are now.
well,
They legitimately. It's funny to say the mob is legitimately involved, but
Well, that's actually a good.
It's a dichotomy. It's it's a kind of an oxymoron, but they're
That's
really
actually a good point. We started with the idea of like
you can't make this shit up, George.
I know.
We started with the low salary from law enforcement leading to the possibility of corruption. Well, let's flip the script on that. When you mentioned their involvement in garbage, obviously there's casinos and other things. Have there been cases where the mobs, some of their legitimate fronts have become so successful they've abandoned the crime side of it and just become legit? Does that happen, or is that just the fairy tale?
I think there's a lot of trash companies that make a lot of legitimate money, but they also make more by working illegitimate operations as well. I don't know that anybody has said, "Wow, this is really better than being a street guy. I want to be a legitimate businessman." No, I don't. Most of those guys don't have that mindset. Most of those guys think working 9 to 5, you're a sucker. If you got to get up every day and go to work Monday through Friday, you're a sucker, and that's we don't want to do that. That's the mindset of a lot of these guys I've talked to.
Well, let me ask you something. I don't know if it's tied to it, but in research, I saw it come up a lot when they talked about grunts and just the dirty handwork and some of the local people. The word zip came up a lot. What is that?
Zip is a reference to an Italian immigrant. Usually it's a Sicilian. He's a zip. He's from Sicily.
Okay.
He's not one of us. And that was one of the interesting things in the Stanfa-Marino War. Stanfa was from Sicily, and he had brought in some young hitmen from Sicily, and they were the Zips. There was, in the midst of that whole Stanfa-Marino War, there was this cultural divide. They were the South Philly corner boys, and he was this interloper from Italy who didn't even know where Broad Street was. It was that kind of thing. So that played it into that.
Well, if you know anything about the history of Sicily and Italy, up until recently, and I say recently in the past, 100 years, in the grand scheme of things, Sicily didn't even consider themselves Italian. They didn't want to be associated with Italy. They were Sicilian.
Italians didn't consider them Italian either.
Well, you're right. Yeah, it worked both ways. And there's still a lot of that in Italy. If you're from the south of Italy and you go to the north of Italy, a lot of times you'll be looked down upon.
Oh, yeah. And let's talk about that. There's a lot of resentment within the culture itself, George.
Well, that's interesting, Angelo. One of the things I say to people who aren't Italian is, you don't understand. Within the Italian culture, Sicilian, Napoletan, Abruzzese, everybody has an identity separate and apart from just being Italian. And each has kind of a quirky trait. Sicilians are secretive and dark. Napoletan is a rooster. Somebody from Naples is a rooster.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a phrase, faccio una bella figura, means put on a good face. But what it means is, it's good to be good at what you do, but it's just as important to look good while you're doing it. That's Naples. Whereas in Sicily, So
it was always kind of a running joke, George, in my family, because I'm Calabrese and Bruzzese, and they're known as murderers and chefs. We could fix you your last meal for you. I mentioned that to Dominic DiNucci the other night. Remember, Dan? Yes, I said I was Calabrese and Bruzzese. He went, "Oh, you're Calabrese." I went, "Yeah, Calabrese and Bruzzese." He went, "Oh, you're Bruzzese, huh?" Yeah.
My wife is half Bruzzese, half Sicilian, and Bruzzese are the best cooks. Absolutely the best cooks. The food is great. I've been there.
That's what I'm telling you. The Calabrese and Bruzzese, they're murderers and chefs.
Anybody will tell you, and I'm sure you've seen it, and you guys, we're all Italians here. Northern Italy, as far as cuisine and culture, and Southern Italy, as far as cuisine and culture, might as well be on two different planets.
Day and night. Oh, day and night.
Absolutely. Yeah. So.
Day and night.
And
along those lines, it was interesting because the first time I ever saw a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Italian was my cousin from Venice.
Yeah.
they came here to visit. I never met her before. Beautiful, beautiful girl. But, blonde hair, blue eyes and I said, she's Italian?
Yeah, yeah.
Like maybe she was, French or, one of George Anastasia's coffee drinking partners from Paris back then. But no, but there's a lot of blonde hair, blue-eyed Italian. Frank Sinatra was a blue-eyed Italian. People don't understand that. We're a handsome group of people. We really are. I got to tell you that.
I mean,
right, Daniel?
Absolutely.
At the history of Sicily, Sicily was always being overrun by a different country. The Greeks, the Moors, the French.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, everybody had a piece of Sicily at one time or another. So genetically, that all becomes part of the genes. Sinatra
well, you mentioned the Moors. George, that's a really great segue because I found this out recently.
I want to see
the Moors invaded Sicily. They raped and pillaged. They raped the women, killed the men. They impregnated a lot of the women, but they gave birth to some of the prettiest babies in the world. These dark-skinned, men and these fair-skinned women gave birth to these olive-skinned. I mean, look at me. Come on, okay? I'm probably George. Don't give me that.
No, listen. I mean, I think that's part of the charm of Sicily is Sicily was a melting pot long before anybody else was a melting pot.
I joke about it, but the truth is that we're probably as big a mixed bag of fish as anybody else, ethnically speaking. But they sure did make some pretty babies.
Well, speaking of if we're touching on Sicilians, a lot of immigrants.
The Sicilians too much, okay? Because they watch the show.
Well, that's where my family's from, Sicily and Southern Italy. Like, but when we talk, it's funny because we're talking about the mob. Throughout Europe and Russia and Asia and Japan, all over the world, there's organized crime. When immigrants came to America, the Irish brought a mob. The Jewish people brought a mob. The Russians brought the mob. The Asian immigrants had their own sects of organized crime. Why is it whenever people say mob, they immediately just picture the Italian gangsters and are shocked to know anyone else in the world besides Italians have an organized crime?
I think part of it is pop culture. Part of it is the media, the movies. I mean, if you look at the examples you just talked about, if you look in the media in America today, they talk about the Russian mafia, the Asian mafia, the black mafia. Well, that's an Italian word, and it stems from everybody has a frame of reference when you talk about Italian organized crime. And you're right. And if you look at the turn of the last century, Jews, Irish, and Italians, large influx of immigrants, each of those groups had gangsters. Yet it's the Italians that have emerged as the dominant player. And I think it has a lot to do with, guys like Mario Puzo wrote the book, and Coppola made the movie, and away we went. And before
George,
that,
I have a question for you right along those lines, and it ties right into what you're talking about. The word mafia, was that a desecration of the word familia, a family?
That's a great question, Angelo. There's a lot of different theories. Real quick, one is that it was a derivative of two Arabic words that meant hiding in a cave. Another was that it was an acronym for death to the French, Italy cries. This is when the French dominated Sicily. But that can't work because, as you guys already mentioned, in the 15th, 14th century, when France controlled Sicily, there was no Italy. Sicily was Sicily.
Yeah.
The most romantic explanation, and I don't think this is true, but it's the one I like the best, is the French are controlling Sicily, and in a little village, a young Sicilian maiden is married, and the French garrison of soldiers kidnap her and rape her on her wedding night. And her mother runs through the village crying, "My daughter, my daughter." And Italian is "ma figlia, ma figlia." But the Sicilians, they swallow a lot of the consonants. So she's crying, "Ma figlia, ma figlia." And the men of the village rose up. They slaughtered the garrison of French soldiers and went up into the hills. And that's where mafia came from.
Interesting.
I don't think that's true, but it's the one I like the best.
I love that. I'd never heard that explanation. But where did if it's interesting because you get that, and it's, there's a tragic romance to that, but then you hear something like the Black Hand.
Right.
Where did the acronym the lexicon of the Black Hand come from?
This was in New York at the turn of the last century when there was a big Italian immigration population. And there was a group of gangsters, Italians, who preyed on Italian business people. If you had a push cart, if you had a store, and you would get a note and it would have a black hand on it. It would be a handprint in ink put on a piece of paper. And you would told, if you had a push cart, you give us $1 a week or you're gonna have a problem. And they would destroy the push cart.
Protection money.
Right, it was extortion. And the Black Hand, that was the Black Hand. There was gangsters preying on their own. Eventually, the gangsters evolved into racketeers and became dominant in the American industry. That was at the beginning. Yeah.
Were there, along those lines, was there resistance between the traditional, to use that word, the traditional mafia and the quote unquote Black Hand? Was there conflict between these two groups at any point in our history?
I don't think there was. It wasn't so much there were two groups. There were a lot of different factions of either the Black Hand, and then it evolved into the mafia. There was always friction, who controlled what neighborhood, who was going to be able to shake down who. But it wasn't Black Hand versus mafia. It just was. A lot of times it would be the older mustache Pete's versus the young up and comers, like the Castellamari's War in 1931. It was Luciano and Costello and Lansky against the old time mob bosses, and basically the young guys took over, and that modernized the American mafia. So.
George, was there ever a time that a rogue group of gangsters or mobsters organized and were accepted by the more established mob, or did you have to go through that chain of command or pay your, for lack of a better word, but pay your dues to pay your tributes?
No, I think it varied depending on where you are. I can remember in Philadelphia during the Bruno years, Harry Riccobini had his own little separate organization within the organization. And Bruno was content to let Harry do what he needed to do. In North Jersey, there was the Campeses were involved. They were a subset of a crime family up there. And most times, either you're paying some tribute or everybody's getting along because they're all making money.
Yeah.
For us, the friction. No, it's not. I don't know too many examples of that kind of stuff.
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, if we can, continue with that, what Angelo just brought up was a really good point with like these infightings and moving up. I'm curious. I asked last episode about how the pop culture portrayal impacted people wanting to be gangsters and wanting to get involved in organized crime. How would, say, someone not tied to the family, just some random immigrant or some random kid on the street, how do you approach the family to say, hey, I want to run for you guys, I want to be, break legs or whatever? How does that go about?
Well, usually you know somebody, and then you got to do something to prove yourself, or else maybe you're making a little bit of money on your own. You're running your own book, and you're going to edge off to these guys. I mean, they
don't accept resumes anymore, George.
Look, access. You just can't go knock on the door and say, hey, I want to be a gangster. Usually it's, a guy that knows a guy, you've been actively involved, you've done some stuff, and, somebody will spot you and say, yeah, he knows what he's doing. Let's bring him in. Let's you become an associate, and you work your way up the ladder. That's usually what happens, And if you're a thug and you want to be violent, you can fast track, but that's a lot of times.
And the term they use for that, again, more mafia terminology, the term they use for that, ladies and gentlemen, is called making your bones.
Making your bones, doing some work. Yeah,
doing some work. They used to call it paying your dues, but that was too general, too broad. Making your bones.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Danny.
Well, then, continuing with that being involved, I know one of the tricks you touched on it earlier with people turning and witness protection and whatnot. What was the likelihood or method for trying to implant a mole or somebody like that, like somebody who's working who was working with the police from day one?
Well, FBI undercover agent like Donnie Brasco would start hanging out at bars and restaurants where wise guys hang out and pose as where the Donnie Brasco pose as moving stolen jewelry, that kind of stuff, and establish himself. That's usually what they do with an undercover.
So no pun intended, but it's more of the long con. You have to you could spend months building a backstory or building a reputation.
Absolutely. For the undercover operations that have worked have been long term. I mean, you don't just all of a sudden you're sitting down with the capital talking about stuff. You're sitting down with a wise guy, and maybe you become an associate of that guy, and eventually you get introduced into the family and other people, and then start hanging out with the group. But no, it's not. You can't just go, yeah, I'm a bad guy, I want to be with you guys.
So Donnie Brasco, who was in reality is Joseph Pistone,
right?
FBI, a veteran FBI agent. His infiltration took years, George. And I saw an interview he did recently. It really affected him. He said, you and I were just talking about, you and I and Dan were just talking about the likability factor. Some of these guys are very likable.
Oh, yeah.
And Joe Pistone had a real problem at one point, not that, he always knew his job, but he had a real problem, he had to walk away when the hammer finally came down on his crew, and when they showed, his picture to these people and said, do you know this guy? Well, he's an FBI informant. He's an agent. He's one of us. They went crazy, and it broke his heart because, he was tight with these guys. He broke bread with them. He hung out with their families, and, particularly the Al Pacino character, who you kind of had to feel sorry for because he was just such a mamalouk,
Lefty Ruggiero. Yeah.
Yeah, Lefty, but, the last of the old-time characters, Lefty Ruggiero was a unique individual. Not real bright. He, the lights weren't always on in his apartment. But Dan, where we're going with that is that, we love the bad guy. Even in wrestling, we love the heel.
It's
unfortunately, far too often in real life, these heels, they end up being really nice guys, George. But sadly, what they do is, is illegal. It's against the law, and and it makes not only us as a people, the Italian people, look bad, but it paints us with this brush that, if you're Italian, you got to be connected somewhere, somehow. I remember growing up when I was a kid. Oh, well, your name's DeCipio, so you're in the mafia.
Yeah.
Let's talk. Let's address the.
Imagine that.
Yeah, imagine that, Dan. Right?
Oh, I got that too.
Dan got it, especially Dan, because he's from the Philadelphia, New Jersey area, but he's in Norfolk, Virginia, in witness protection right now. He actually works for the United States Navy. God bless him, and God bless our Navy.
I always tell people.
Go ahead, Dan.
I always tell people, that because I still have family up there. As an Italian, I'm required by law to have at least one cousin that lives in New Jersey.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, did they refer to you as an Italian?
Italian.
I mean, I think the farther you are away from an urban center where there's been an ethnic Italian community, the less you understand, and the more easy it is to buy into the stereotypes.
Right.
Yeah. George, you don't even want to know what happened to me, brother. I lived in Tennessee for 15 years.
God bless you.
And I made a joke. It was the first, last, and only time I ever did that, because I'm going to tell you what happened. I got to Tennessee. I was there. It was my first week in Tennessee. The store clerk says, "You ain't from around here." I said, "No, I'm not." "Where are you from?" "New Jersey." "What are you doing? What brings you here?" That was his quote. "What brings you here?" I said, and I quote, "Witness protection program." He called the fucking police. I'm not kidding you. He called the police. You can't make this stuff up. And I
That's
said,
funny.
no, it was a joke.
Yeah.
I'm Italian. Yes. I'm from New Jersey. Yes. But I'm not in the program. Call the FBI. They'll tell you. Go ahead, Dan. Rescue me from this shit.
Well, excuse me. You know, what he was you mentioned with the stereotype and how the further you are away. I'm curious then to expand on, obviously Jersey has one. Well, I lived in Maryland for a while. Baltimore had one. Parts of Virginia have them. What is it about the Italian populations, and specifically, you know, unfortunately, that kind of stereotype where pretty much every major city has a Little Italy, that has, you know, an area where that's just something about Italian immigrants. They kind of all tend to group together. Whereas you can see, you know, there's 3 or 4 different Irish neighborhoods or areas where, you know, the Jews or blacks live. But there's always only just that one big area that everybody knows that's the Italian neighborhood. Like, what is it about Italians that tend to do that?
Well, you know, I think partly it's just a sense of family, and you want to be around your cousins, your uncles, your aunts, and I think what happened if you look with the mafia took the values of the Italian-American experience, honor, loyalty, and a sense of family, and they bastardized it to their own ends. But the Italian community believes in those same principles: honor, loyalty, blood loyalty, and family is more important than anything. And then the other thing is, let's sit around and have a good meal. Let's have, you know, that's very important.
Exactly.
And one of the things, I think one of the reasons Tony Soprano and The Sopranos was so popular was that people were living vicariously. People who were what we would call Medigans got to see and try to be a part of that. You know, let's have a dinner. You know, that kind of stuff. Let's have some food. Let's have gabagool. You know, with that kind of stuff. It's
very infectious, George. It really, really is. I got to tell you, you know, in all seriousness, when I was in Tennessee, I spent 15 years in Tennessee. I got to tell you, brother, the busiest restaurants were always the Italian restaurants. Yeah. The Italian centers were always where the people wanted to be. It's our culture as a people is just infectious. Our music, our lifestyle, our entertainment, our comedy. I mean, some of the people that made me laugh were Lou Carey, Pat Cooper. Oh my God, who the hell else was it? Oh God, George, I'm having a brain fart. What was his name?
I don't know.
Oh, Rossi, Allen and Rossi.
Right.
Yeah, Marty Allen and Steve Rossi. Handsome guy, a singer, funny, with a big, tall, good-looking Italian guy and a short, fat Jew.
Yeah, Martin and Lewis.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
They set the
exactly. And it's funny that you mentioned that because our culture is also closely associated with the Jews. Again, the sense of family, music, culture. Let's talk. I'm going to take a segue here, and I want to talk about your latest book, which is Gotti's Rules, and the new one. And I want to let you introduce the new one to everyone. Tell us why this book, Gotti's Rules, is so controversial. I shared with you before we went on the air some information brought to my attention by a we'll just say, and I'm not going to give them any credit, and I certainly don't want you to, but a rival website, we'll say, that took a big giant dump on you and John Alite.
Yeah. I mean, Gotti's Rules is built around John Alite's story. John Alite was a Gambino crime family associate. Wasn't a member because he's Albanian, but he was a major player in that era, and he was connected to John Gotti Jr. And the friction is between Alite and John Gotti Jr. Now, John Gotti Jr. and his family hate the book Gotti's Rules. And basically, I mean, look, John Gotti Jr., his sister, their family, they see their father, John Gotti Sr., as their father. And, you know, they have a different perception of it. But they've helped create this myth of who John Gotti Sr. really was. And the reality is, I think, the John Gotti Sr. that John Alite talks about, which is a guy who ran the crime family into the ground. Now, I had another member of the Gambino family back then tell me, you know, this was supposed to be our thing, When John became the boss, it was my thing. It was everything was about him.
Yeah.
So, and Gotti was an example of this celebrity gangster. Look at me, I'm a gangster.
Yeah.
So Gotti's rules is John A. Light's story, how he got involved and how he came to testify against Gotti Jr. And one of Gotti's rules, for example, the father, one of the rules is don't deal drugs. But if you're dealing drugs, I want a piece of the action. That's the hypocrisy of John Gotti Sr. And the other thing in the Gotti's rules book that I think gets under the skin of Gotti Jr. is that at one point, John Gotti Jr. tried to cut a deal with the feds. He sat down and had what they call a proffer session, where he offered to give up information. A proffer session, if anybody doesn't know, you sit down and you tell the government what you have, and they decide whether to take you on or not. If they don't take you on, nothing you said can be used against you. So Gotti has this proffer session, Gotti Jr. They call it Queen for a Day, that old TV show.
Well, George, if you mind me interjecting for a moment, isn't that the height of hypocrisy, though?
Well, yeah. And in Gotti's rules, we, among the things that are in the book is a reproduction of the 5-page FBI memo about John Gotti Jr. sitting down with the feds and offering up all kind of information about murder, bribery, extortion, that kind of stuff. And then he wants to step away and say, no, I'm a stand-up guy. Well, A. Light, who was, and the book opens with it, A. Light in this horrible prison in Brazil, he's hearing about Gotti Jr. making a deal, and A. Light saying, what am I standing up for? Why am I being a stand-up guy? And that's when A. Light flips. So there's a lot of animosity between the two. That's a long answer to your question, but that's where it comes from.
In the interest of full disclosure, I did not read the book, but I did, quite frankly, listen to all 9.5 hours of the audiobook. So I did listen to your audiobook. It's a long listen. It's about 9.5, almost 10 hours of listening. I'm not much of a reader because I'm always busy doing other stuff, but I did listen to that, and it's extensive. And I encourage everybody, if you're not inclined to sit and read a book and you just want to listen to the audiobook, it is available. It's still available on a number of platforms. It's just to search Gotti's Rules audiobook. George Anastasia is the author. It's the story of John A. Light, a self-confessed murderer, extortionist, jack of all trades in the world of organized crime. He did it all. And
the other interesting thing about John A. Light, I mean, I genuinely like John. I met him. He contacted me and was looking for somebody to write a book about him. But the thing that fascinated me about John is he ended up getting arrested in Brazil. He was on the run for a couple of years, and that's how he ended up in a Brazilian prison. But John A. Light, when he decided he had to get out of town, basically he said to me, look, if I stayed, either I was going to have to kill Junior or Junior was going to kill me. So I decided to leave. And he had enough money. He took off. Now, guys in Philadelphia, a couple of guys went on a run, and they went to Brigantine or the Poconos. That's like the edges of the universe. You can't go any further, so we're going to fall off. John A. Light was in France. He was in Albania. He was in Spain. He was in Africa. He was in and out of Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil. He went to all these places, and he thoroughly enjoyed exposure to different cultures. Started to speak different languages. He's a different type of guy. And that's one of the things that I tried to get in the book. But also, that's one of the things that to me made him more believable. He never tried to sugarcoat what he did, and never tried to spin it. He was what he was. He understands how terrible it was, and now he's trying to change his life. And that's, I think, what's under Gotti Jr.'s skin.
Dan, explore the avenue of the smart gangster.
Well, when you mentioned, how you said he was a different kind of guy, and we had talked earlier in the program, you talked about how some of the people that were getting wiretapped didn't quite understand it. What kind of I don't want to say worldly success, that sounds too cliche, but when you have somebody who speaks multiple languages, who might be educated in various things prior to or during their time with the families and with the organized crime, what kind of success rate or leg up do you have when you're that kind of worldly person versus some of and it happens because of how culturalized the Italian communities are, where you could live your entire life without going 10 miles from the hospital you were born in. So what kind of a difference do you have there as far as success, moving up, that kind of thing?
Well, if you accept the fact that organized crime is now international as opposed to being local, and I think by and large it is international, then the better you are at interacting with other kind of ethnic groups, and if you speak a little bit of the language, Spanish, for example, if you're in the drug underworld, I mean, all of those things are, there are things that you can use to advance your trade. Just like any other business, if you're bilingual and you're an international businessman, it's going to help you out. Same thing with this. The other thing is, in terms of the economics, I thought that's where you're going to go with this, Dan, is some guys know how to make money. Some guys know how to,
I was going to have you expand on that, because we touched on it on the last episode, the international flair. Obviously, when people think international crime, they picture, the drugs coming in from this, through the border and Mexico and Colombia and all. But there's a lot of money to be made in international racketeering, in international trade. There's you talked about even things like gambling. I know there's a lot of gambling that goes on.
Can I throw something in here, Dan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add something, and then I'll let you and George talk. Here's one for you: the internet. Yeah. How has the internet changed the way the mob does business?
Well, internet gambling is a big example, and internet gambling setting up those kind of operations. The other thing about internet gambling that's an advantage for the guy running the book is you can use your credit card. You can bet on credit. I mean, that's one of the things that a mob bookmaker has going over a sports book in Vegas. In Vegas, you're going to put your money up when you place your bet. A mob bookmaker, you can bet on credit for 3-4 weeks before you got to settle up. And the gambler's going to keep chasing. That's what happens. But in terms of the money flow, I mean, big time guys, international, they can get money coming in from drugs. They can get money coming in from a stolen car ring, stealing cars here, putting them on a boat and sending them over there, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of ways to make money, but you can also be a big earner locally. You don't have to be international. I mean, Ronnie Previty was an example of that. Previty had money coming in from bookmaking, from gambling, from brothels, from extortion, all kind of cash flow. And that's what he was very entrepreneurial. And Ronnie used to say, he would talk about Joey Merlino, and he would say basically Joey Merlino's problem is Joey's agenda on Monday is to get to Tuesday. Joey just get the money, spend the money. Where Ronnie said you got to establish a flow, you got to have money coming in, just like a businessman. That's,
then let me ask you, because you said how it goes international. Is there still the small family rings where you might have a couple dozen guys that run 10, 20 city blocks and that's it? Like the old school mafia that people picture?
Well, I think you see that in the drug underworld, especially you take Philadelphia, for example. There's no one dominant drug organization. It's neighborhood run, and this is my corner, that's your corner kind of thing. So yeah, you see a lot of that. And in terms of the mob, I mean, you want to talk about the mafia. The mafia is not the dominant player anymore in the American underworld. And the other thing that's really hurt them is COVID. Think about it. I mean, sports betting is a big moneymaker. Well, it's only just recently we started to have any sports. So, they were hit that way as well. And they don't get
it's funny, George. We talked about that on the last show, how, when Matt Granahan was here. And by the way, Matt is actually on his way to Abu Dhabi to promote a fight right now. So that's why Matt's not here. But on the last show, and I think it might have been Dan that brought it up, is how COVID and all the other social ills have affected the mob's cash flow. But the one thing that and we talked about this before, the one thing that hasn't been affected is the drugs. Largely, though, on the street level, it's the Jamaicans, it's African-American communities, local neighborhood kingpins. Big in for whatever reason, the Jamaican drug cartels and the South American drug cartels are huge in inner city areas, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, all these, the big city hotbeds. Miami, of course, down south. But go ahead, Dan, explore it. I'm sorry to jump in there, but go ahead.
No, you're okay. I was actually hoping before we get into that, you touched on something. Maybe you said that the mafia, as people think of, it's not the dominant player in organized crime in the United States anymore. Well, two-part question for that then. One, who is, and two, where would you say the mob ranks now?
Yeah, I don't think we know who is. And partly it may be, you mentioned earlier, Russian organized crime. Russian organized crime is still very much an ethnic operation, and you can't pierce the shield of ethnicity. You can't get into those Russian communities yet. They haven't been Americanized enough. You don't know the face of Russian organized crime. John Gotti could be the face of the American Mafia. Who's the Russian mob boss in America? We don't know. Somebody is. We just don't know. And you've got Hispanic drug gangs. You got Asian organized crime. Asian organized crime has been around forever, but it's basically kept to itself, kept within its own community. So those groups maybe have learned from the mafia. You don't want to become too Americanized. You become more Americanized, second and third generation. And that's what happened, I think, with the Italians. Second and third generation Italian Americans, the best and the brightest are doctors and lawyers and educators. And the mob.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll vouch for that. I have a niece that's a nurse. I have a nephew that's a doctor. I have another nephew that's a high-powered makeup executive. But
that's one of the things that I don't want to get political, but one of the things that bothers me about this anti-immigration movement is my grandparents came to this country in 1910, 1920. They didn't speak English. They didn't have a skill. If you put that kind of prohibition, I wouldn't be sitting here today. So, immigrants bring a lot to this country, whatever the immigrant.
George, if you take every immigrant out of this country, we won't have a country, brother. I got news for you.
We're not a country that we love. No.
We are a country of it. This country is immigrants. There are no real Americans. There are no real Americans. The Native Americans, yeah. But there wasn't even a name for the country when they were here.
Right.
You mentioned the drugs, and I wanted to segue a little bit.
George, before you
go ahead.
I was just going to say, George, before you get into that, we have to really clarify something because it pisses me off when people say, it's American as apple pie. Well, if you really want to get down to it, folks, let's talk about it. Should be American as a bowl of pasta because this country is named after an Italian. His name was Amerigo Vespucci, and he was Christopher Columbus, another Italian. He was Christopher Columbus's navigator. So you owe us, all right? Where's my reparation?
Well, he drew the map, and he had America, his name at the bottom of the map, and that's where we got America. Yeah.
Yep.
That's where
they talk about Black Lives Matter. Italian lives matter too. I want my reparation.
Everybody matters.
Well, we had
shut
ours.
Up now, George.
You said it. The best and brightest Italians, doctors, lawyers, politicians running the country. It was the doofuses left over that do end up hosting podcasts.
Well, yeah, right. But no, it's the truth, though. People lose sight of the fact that this country was founded by an Italian. It was chartered by an Italian, but yet no mention of, it's American is this, American is that. Well, I got news for you.
Let's not glorify Columbus too much. He was a piece of shit.
Yeah, there's history was kind to Columbus, and I think post Columbus it's less kind. I think that's the way.
But, well, you wanted to circle back to what we were talking about. You had just started on economics, so
yeah.
I mean, the economics of organized crime. I think I mentioned this the last time I was on. A guy told me vice is commerce. That's the way you have to look at it. Vice is commerce. Whatever way you can make money, you try to make money, and the better organized you are, the more money you're going to make, and that's what organized crime is about. If they're organized and they run an operation, they can be successful and they can stay under the radar. That's where violence creates problems because now you got the spotlight. If you can get away with it without the violence, you can have a pretty long run. And especially now, with other ethnic groups that are emerging and with terrorism becoming a priority, law enforcement doesn't have the same resources aimed toward the mafia as it did, say, 30, 40 years ago. But the other thing I wanted to mention, we talked about drugs. Another big drug is the opioid crisis. That's ripping. And that's the current book that I have out called Dr. Dealer is about a doctor in Atlantic County was running a pill mill with the pagan biker gang. and getting opioids out on the street. And then he hired one of the pagans to kill his wife.
Yes.
His name was James Kaufman. The woman who was killed was April Kaufman. It was a famous murder down in Atlantic County in 2012. She was a radio personality. So, and that's what the new book is about. It's called Dr. Dealer, and it's about that case.
If you're watching this and you don't know who Dr. Kaufman and his wife April Kaufman were, just Google them. There will hundreds and hundreds of results will come up, thousands of results. It was a well-documented murder. The trial was covered nationally. It is one of the most horrific murder cases because of the deviousness of it. What this guy didn't put his wife through is just crazy. Remarkable that that a woman had to endure this level of torture.
Right.
And I won't tip the hat, but I'll leave it at that.
No, and then
yeah.
James,
Go ahead,
James
Dan.
Kaufman killed himself, hung himself in jail rather than stand trial.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, really interesting story. I think I might have mentioned this before. I mean, I've written a lot about gangsters and wise guys, but James Kaufman, Thomas Capano, the lawyer from Wilmington, I wrote a book about called The Summer Wind, and Rabbi Newlander and Cherry Hill.
Yes.
Three guys with power, wealth, and status.
Yes.
All three of them, two of them killed their wives, one of them killed his mistress. Those guys are more despicable than any mob boss, any mobster I've ever written about. Those guys were all going for them, and they thought literally they could get away with murder. And this latest book is about James Kaufman, who's one of those guys.
Yep. Thomas Capano, of course, was a high-profile, high-powered Delaware attorney.
Right. Absolutely.
Rabbi Fred Newlander was a congregant over one of the largest Jewish congregations in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, if not the largest, who had a rather sordid, very public affair with a Philadelphia radio personality named Elaine Sonsini, who herself was a married woman, married to a man in a wheelchair named Ken Garland, a legend in Philadelphia broadcasting.
Absolutely. And the way Elaine Sonsini meets the rabbi is when Ken is dying, he finally dies, she asked the rabbi to officiate at his funeral. And that's how they connect.
Yeah.
It's a sordid, you're right. It's a very sordid story. Very.
It's really just, you can't make this stuff up. It's like, this is the stuff that movie scripts are made out of, George. It really is.
Some of the better ones.
Go ahead, Danny.
No, I was agreeing with you. It's some of the better ones that, I think we touched on this when we talked about the cinema with The Godfather and with, Goodfellas and Donnie Brasco and some of those, where a lot of this just writes itself. And if I remember correctly, George, you mentioned Donnie Brasco being one of the most accurate portrayals of organized crime.
Yeah, I think Donnie Brasco and Goodfellas are the most accurate. I mean, the Godfather movies 1 and 2 are great cinema, but I think in terms of being realistic, Goodfellas and Donnie Brasco are the two best, and showing you the way their life really is. Absolutely.
George, I saved the best for last because we're going to have some fun with this guy.
Go ahead.
The Godfather. The character in The Godfather named Carlo. He's an actor, singer, performer. You're laughing because you know where I'm going.
Go ahead.
Johnny Russo.
Right.
Okay.
Johnny Russo, right.
Johnny Russo is making headlines here as of late and doing a lot of interviews. Claims to have information on the Kennedy assassination. Claims to know who killed Jimmy Hoffa. Dan, I can't make this shit up, brother. Listen to the interview.
Have you read his? I read his book.
I'm actually listening to the audio book.
I got it in the bookcase behind me. Gianni Russo tells a great story, but my take on Gianni Russo is he's the Forrest Gump of the underworld. He was present at every major event in the underworld.
Well, yeah, I mean, this guy's like, he's got the world secrets, brother.
Yeah, the Kennedy assassination. He met with the Pablo Escobar. He had a conversation with Pablo Escobar.
Sure.
I mean,
they had coffee at a French bistro, George.
And he also had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And it's a great read. I'm not sure how much of it is true, And
well, that's what I'm getting at. Let's talk about this guy. He's got more, he's he's got more tentacles than an octopus. This guy, holy shit. If you believe Johnny Russo, and he's a compelling character because he's a character.
yeah.
He reminds you he's the open collar, 12 chains around his neck. He's still old school.
Yeah.
He's 1976. He
He's in
lives.
that time warp. Yeah.
He's in perfect, George. He's in a time warp. I'm wondering how much of his brain stayed in that time warp because he can't seem to remember anything past 1980. But yeah, he made love to Marilyn Monroe. He was present with Pablo Escobar. He met with Sam Giancana. He did all this. He plotted. He was at a seat at every major event that shaped world history from 1963 to 1976.
He ran money through the Vatican Bank. He got the Shah of Iran some of his money out of Iran. It goes on and on and on. And he negotiated the deal in New York to allow the filming of The Godfather. That's what he says.
That I know. I heard him say that.
I mean, this guy, and he claims a lot. And the book it's an easy read. It's well written. I just don't know how much of it is fact and how much of it is. And a lot of the guys he's written about it.
Yeah, and I wanted to have a little fun with that because I'm going to hit you with a serious question. How much of that does he open himself up to libel?
Well, if you really look at what he's written, most of the stuff he's writing about are about people who are dead, or you can't libel Sam Giancana. You can't libel Al Capone. You can't libel a notorious gangster because how are you going to hurt their reputation?
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean there's a legit point to that, but I mean you have to think to yourself at some point somebody's going to say you'll call bullshit on it,
Well, they can call bullshit on it, but I don't know that there's any legal ramifications based on the stuff he's writing.
And he's allowed them to make money. He's making money. I mean, no question about it. He's still entertaining. Go ahead, Dan.
Not to get all conspiracy, but we've touched on this before on the show.
Well, go ahead, Dan.
What I mean is we had when the Sage of Quay was on, I asked him about why, if everything he's saying is true with how powerful these people are with taking people out, how come you're still alive? Is the fact that he's out there doing book tours and talking about this and nobody's tried to shut him up, is that evidence enough that he's full of crap?
No, because I think if you read his book, he hasn't hurt anybody. It's not like he's implicated anybody in a crime who's going to have some repercussions from what he's saying. He's talking about stuff that had happened in history. And basically, as I said, it's like Forrest Gump. He's present. He's present when the guns were run down for the Kennedy assassination. He was going into a meeting with Carlos Marcello when Lee Harvey Oswald was coming out of the meeting. I mean, it's this crazy.
Yeah, he was there when Elvis recorded Heartbreak Hotel.
I mean, yeah, Angela, you're right. It's that. So it stretches credibility. That's all I want to say.
Man, it stretches credibility. Jesus, holy shit, brother. Oh my God. Well, I'll tell you what, George. It seems like we did an hour, then we did another hour here, hour and a half. I got to tell you, brother, I can make you a regular feature on here and never get tired of talking to you. The book is Dr. Dealer. The next book is Gotti's Rules. The other book after that there's a list of about 4,000 books that you've got that 32, George, 30 books?
No, not that many. I probably got about 6 or 7. And then
okay.
Yeah,
I mean, between the articles and stuff, you probably got several hundred. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But there's another 30 books in there, George. Come on, get to work on them now. Dan, any parting questions for George Anastasia?
No, we touched on a lot, and I do hope that you come back because there's still plenty more to talk about. Yeah. And I think the fact that it's as we would say growing up, the fact that there's a couple of Goombas goofing off, it means more. This conversation means more to us than it would anybody else.
Absolutely.
No, I appreciate it, and I enjoyed talking to both of you guys. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Absolutely. George, thank you so much. You are a welcome guest here anytime. You're close by. I hope to run into you at the supermarket one day, get to shake your hand and sign my book for me, or at least let me buy you dinner somewhere.
Sounds good, Angelo. Thank you.
George Anastasia is one of our favorite people. We love having you here, and I can't wait to read Dr. Dealer.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Take care, and again, I can't thank you enough for being here.
All right.
You're the best. Thanks so much. Take care. George Anastasia, everybody. That was a great show with George.
Yes, sir.
Great show. So, Dan.
Yes, sir.
We've been racking them up here lately. These Italians are coming out of the woodwork. We had Dominic come out. We got George Anastasia coming out.
We have had a bit of a run, haven't we?
We have. I'm telling you, brother. Man, we're getting all the Goombas, to use your. They're all coming out of the woodwork for us. Oh, my God. Oh, by the way, speaking of Dominic DeNucci, speaking of Goombas, I talked to Dominic today, and I'll tell you what, my phone call with Dominic could have been a podcast. Okay. I was on the phone as long today with Dominic as he was on the show with us the other night.
Oh, geez.
When he gets on a roll, you just got to sit there and let him talk and go, uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Smile and nod, right?
Smile and nod. I love that, man. I'll tell you what. I really do. That was a great conversation with George Anastasia. Really, really good. Informative, enlightening, had a little fun. I think the fact that it was just you and I tonight, though, Dan, that we actually had a chance to really kind of, pull back a couple more layers of the onion and get into why we love the mob so much, why we're fascinated with these characters.
Right.
So let me get your take on it. You're the smartest guy in the room, so you tell me. And, because you have to, because it says so on your Twitter that you're the smartest guy. So what's your take on this? Why are we fascinated with the bad guys, with the heels?
Well, I mean, it goes to, we talked about it plenty of times with wrestling, when you have people like, say, the Four Horsemen or Jerry Lawler, some of the Freebirds, some of these guys who were playing the heel characters. But if you're likable and relatable and your motives make sense, which is something we've talked about before with the current product, where there's no face or heel because no one has the motives that you can understand. Like, why are you two fighting? Jim Cornette used to say that the three most important things, I got to know who's fighting, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and why they're fighting. And
exactly.
You when you see the mob and a lot of these guys, we're in it for the money and the family loyalty, and it's like George mentioned, those tenets of being Italian are very, for lack of a better word, it's a romantic lifestyle.
Exactly.
You're loyal to the family, you're loyal to your mom, you got good food, Sunday night, Sunday dinner after church or whatever. And we're running racketeering.
Well, it's like I said on our very first show. Yeah, Dan, as I remember when I said on our very first show, in fact, it might have been one of my opening lines was, why have we romanticized the gangster?
Yeah, well, when you create,
and I think you've given a really solid explanation as to why. There is a correlation between, and it's funny because to hear George talk about, Angelo Bruno, the late Philadelphia Mafia boss, being a nice guy.
Mm-hmm.
But they say he was a really sweet old man who just happened to order the murder of people.
Right.
But he looked like, you remember his picture from before. He looked like a, somebody's grandfather.
Yeah. And that's the thing. You look through some of the big names, you talked about some of the Italian gangsters, even some of I touched on it last show, someone like Pablo Escobar, who everybody knew what he was doing, but he was taking that drug money and he was building schools and housing for the poor and soccer fields. Many of those apartment complexes and field houses, they still use in Colombia. It's still his picture painted on the murals. He was blowing up cars and killing people and killing soldiers and cops, but You know, some people were willing to kind of, I don't want to say look the other way, but you know, when you see this, like in The Godfather, you know, and everybody, or in Goodfellas, and these likable characters, these Tony Sopranos, who are really not good people, but relatable, likable people. You know, he beat up some guy. I'll bet that guy was a jerk anyway.
You just prompted a question, young fella. In war, they call it collateral damage.
Yes.
So let me ask you a question. Are these guys creating their own collateral damage for the better good, for the greater good of their organization? The hits on people, you know, for a lack of a better term, it's, you know, it's collateral damage for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, I think if you're doing hits, yes, I think that's, I don't want to say okay, but you have someone who needs to die, or you when you need them to die, I should say, and they're the only ones that they take the hit. When you start looking at the you know, car bombs and the early mobster days, like, you know, the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and some of these, you know, drive by where I got to kill one guy and you end up shooting 9 people in front of the restaurant.
Yeah,
that's more collateral. I think when it's precision, it's not as bad. But the problem, and George touched on it, is the mob had such a good thing going, and their push for just a little bit more is what opened the can of worms.
Well, and I'll tell you where and when that happened. And it's interesting because you brought up 2 vivid examples of how things go wrong. Keeping in mind that the mob doesn't like to draw attention to itself. The St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago drew all kinds of attention.
Right.
The kind of attention you don't want. That's one example. But where it went off the rails is when little Nicky Scarfo in Philadelphia decided that because he's the boss now, he has the right to wipe out pretty much everybody in the city. And he instigated a 3-year war against every family in the city of Philadelphia that resulted in the death of some 26, 27 people. Mostly his own associates, which is the funny part. It's not funny, haha. It's ironic, but a third of his crew were killed at his hands.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he ordered the death of the son of the man who put him there, the guy who groomed him to be boss. Phil Testa, the chicken man, you know, he killed the handsome Salvi Testa, the crown prince of Philadelphia. You know, these guys. Yeah, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You can't.
It's the script. That's why it can be so easily romanticized in fiction, because a lot of the scripts just write themselves.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it's so bizarre. It's true.
Yep.
You know. And I've said this a million times. You and I've talked about it before. Truth at every angle. Truth at every angle is always stranger and more fascinating than fiction.
Yes,
always.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Speaking of, let's see. Speaking of truth and speaking of fiction. Yeah.
Let's get
Let me lay some truth on you, brother. Here's what we got coming on. We've got, let's see. Oh, this is going to be a good one. Next week, Truth and Fiction return. Stephen Plim's coming back. Stephen Plim returns to Wrestling with the Future, and during the same week, again, following in the tradition of Truth and Fiction, Eddie Mansfield joins us on the 24th.
Nice.
Eddie Mansfield, the guy who exposed the wrestling business on 2020.
Yeah.
For the whole world to see.
That is a conversation I'm looking forward to, because I know he's taken quite the beating, but He
won't from me. He won't take the beating from me. I'll probably give him a standing ovation. No? Share your thoughts, young squire.
Well, my problem with that, obviously, you know me, I'm a purist, always have been, exposing the business. That's why I hate people, you know, we've disagreed on it before. Why I hate, you know, like an Orange Cassidy, you know, where your entire gimmick is wrestling is fake. When you make, I mean, Eddie Mansfield, it's not just 60 Minutes. Anytime Owen Hart, anytime they need to bring out somebody to talk about what you're seeing isn't real, he's the one doing the interviews. And I don't know, I just, to me, it kind of feels wrong to make, I don't want to say make a living, if you understand what I'm saying. You make a living exposing the business. Like, you know, the last thing wrestling needs right now is more Eddie Mansfield interviews.
What he is going to talk about, and I absolutely concur with you. I too am a purist, absolutely, but I'm also one who believes in truth in advertising.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And I can reconcile Eddie Mansfield very simply, because what he didn't really expose the business. What he exposed was World Wrestling Federation, who right after that, and you can't call the timing of this coincidental, right. But right after he did that, World Wrestling Entertainment acknowledged, World Wrestling Federation acknowledged that it was entertainment.
Yeah.
Right after that, interestingly. And right after that, interestingly enough, maybe coincidentally, perhaps not, I think not, is when Vince McMahon petitioned the New Jersey State Athletic Commission for release from the athletic rule and said, oh, we're not athletics. We're not athletes. We're entertainers.
Yeah, exactly. He wanted to be regulated the same way you would a Broadway show versus an athlete. It's not a competition. We're putting on a spectacle.
Mm-hmm. But yet nobody seems to remember that, but they always remember Eddie Mansfield gigging himself.
Yeah, well, don't get me wrong. Vince McMahon, I mean, that whole he even did the primetime address where he talked about what you're seeing is not a real sport, and you know I mean, yes, I
when
agree.
Did that occur, Dan?
Some of Mansfield definitely should deserve credit for that, but some of that too was, you know, McMahon wanted the money. He didn't want to have to pay the athletic commission fees if he didn't have to.
And I'm going to tell you what else he didn't want to pay, and this is why Eddie's going to come on. He didn't want to pay for insurance benefits.
Yes.
For these guys that were mutilating their bodies and bleeding out like crazy. He didn't want to pay for that.
Right.
They were paying out of their own pocket. Some of these guys were making, you're not going to believe this, but, and I have a copy of it. You can check it out. A guaranteed contract, you're going to shit when I tell you this. I'm not even making this up. A guaranteed contract for the World Wrestling Federation was 10 matches at $50 a match. Okay?
Yeah.
Why don't you think about that? That was their guaranteed contract. You're guaranteed 10 matches at $50 a match. That's what they were getting. Okay?
Yeah.
And you can check it out yourself. This contract is available online. You can view it.
Oh, we had a couple, you know, back when we had the roundtable discussion with Duke the Dumpster, Duke Drosy. He told the story about, you know, getting paid $20-$30 a day because it's like, look, take the cash now, or you'll get your paycheck at the end of the month. And it's like, well, shit, I need gas to get to the next venue. So you know, these guys were making some of them less than $50 a day.
All right, now here we go. Just a couple nights ago, I talked about a conversation I had with Red Bastine. All right. Red Bastien talked to me in a restaurant in New York City, Mario's restaurant on 61st and Lexington. We sat there, had a glass of wine, and talked. And Red said they spent virtually every waking moment between their car or a hotel. They lived out of a suitcase.
Yep.
Wrestled every night, twice on Saturday, a matinee and an evening show, and on Sunday, a matinee and evening show. 2 shows Saturday, 2 shows Sunday. He said the biggest payoff he ever got at any given time was $75. And that was a big deal.
Yep.
Now, let's just think about something. We're talking about, on average, he said the average pay was between $20 and $25. Okay? $75 was a big payday for him.
Yeah.
Here, that's talking about back in the 40s and 50s, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about Duke the Dumpster Droese, who wrestled in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Making $30. Think about that.
Yep. Well, you have that now with the whole push, and several high-profile media outlets have looked at it in the last, I'd say, maybe 2 or 3 years with this what defines an independent contractor.
Let's talk about that, Dan.
I remember I'm not a big fan of his work or some of what he's done on social media, but WWE used to have a competitor named Ryback, and when Ryback left the company, he very much blasted how much bullshit it was. And he said his worst year, because between insurance and medical costs and things he had to shoulder with like transport and all that stuff, he said he spent almost $100,000 on the road. Yeah. Paying for a lot of that shit out of pocket. Now, granted, he was making, probably $400,000 or $500,000 on his contract, but you have this push where they say, "Oh,
it was costing him, Dan. It was costing him to go to work."
Basically, well, and that's a big thing now. It's just the story just broke about a week or 2 ago, where Vince McMahon put a deadline on his performers that they're not allowed to have third-party contracts. And apparently, during that discussion, it was revealed in the that several of them had contracts where the WWE owns their real name and likeness. So like somebody say like. I'll use example, like an Xavier Woods who has a YouTube channel under a different name. Well, we own your name and likeness, so we get a chunk of that money, or you don't have that website. Paige just recently changed her screen name from her Twitch channel because they made her, you can't use the name. Obviously, certain people like an AJ Styles who's owns that name because that's him. Yeah. But yeah, the fact that you're telling these people you're an independent contractor, so I don't have to pay you anything. I don't have to give you insurance. I don't have to provide this, that, and the other. But you work when I tell you. You can't work for anybody else. And
Dan, let me ask you a question, because you're a guy who has your, more so than I, you're a guy who has your nose to the grindstone on this. How? Explain to me how you even get away with that, and how someone hasn't, after all these years, because this is not a new practice with them.
No, they've been doing it.
How have they gotten away with it? And if you're an independent contractor, by virtue of that, you're self-employed, are you not?
That is correct.
If that's the case, how does the WWE own anything from a self-employed contractor? They don't.
Well, the WWE gets away with it.
I have I have a problem on many levels with.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's ridiculous. Even last week tonight, it's a John Oliver hosts. It's a comedy news show on
I know
HBO.
John Oliver is.
John Oliver did an entire segment about a year ago on the WWE, just how ridiculous it was. And obviously the WWE went front and center with concussions and things, but they get away with it for 2 reasons. One, independent contractor is more of a label than the way their contracts actually work. And the other thing is WWE is right now for years they've been the only dog in the yard. Now, when you were in the territory days, even the early days of WWE, when they had arrangements with certain promotions, like even through the 90s when they worked with Smoky Mountain, you were an independent contractor because you worked elsewhere. Hulk Hogan went to Japan, and Randy Savage and some of these guys went to the Memphis area. So you were technically a contractor, but now today you're exclusive 100%. They get away with it because I'm sure their legal team is probably top notch. But the other thing is, if you don't want to sign this contract, don't. And there's 1,000 indie guys making $50 a month that would take your spot in a heartbeat, and we can pay them less than what I just offered you. So
good, pay them less, because you know what? If I'm a talent of any worth, I'm going to say to them, they need the money more than I do. Because I have talent and I can go out and make my own money.
You saw that with some of the wrestlers that have gone to AEW in over the last year. Some of them, the Revival being the big one, or excuse me, the FTR now, since the WWE owns the Revival. They turned down something like $750,000 a year contracts to go make half that, because it was like, it's not about the money. You're wasting my life. Not booking me properly and treating me like garbage. I'm not taking your dirty money.
I'm going to tell you something. The best validation of that comes from Cody Rhodes. Mm. And if you don't want his validation, or you can't stand to listen to him, listen to his brother, Dustin Rhodes.
Yep.
Dustin Runnels. Those two brothers, they don't even own their name, okay?
Yeah.
They can't call themselves, well, he probably can now, but I don't even know what the status of that is. But I know that if Dusty were alive, it would be a whole different ball game.
Yep.
Because Dusty would walk into Vince's office with a baseball bat and bust him open, and he would do it. But, when you can't even use the name that you're known by universally, and that a name that your father used for 40, 50 years before that,
then
there's a problem. And how they're getting around that, it boggles me. It confines my, my traditional thinking of like, well, isn't this just common sense? This is your name, and that's who you are. Well, no, apparently it's not that simple.
They did that with certain trademarks too, not just with the Rhodes names. The Great American Bash and War Games, and these were pay-per-views that Dusty created as a booker.
Exactly.
The WWE renewed copyrights just so Cody couldn't use that name.
I know. Exactly. And why? For what reason?
Because Vince McMahon's a petty douche. That's why.
And that's what we talked about before. It's it's just, why does Vince do it? Because he can.
That's like I said, that's why I'm looking forward to that interview with Eddie Mansfield, because other than respectfully disagreeing, I truly want to hear his inside story on, especially now that Vince is kind of a crazy old bastard,
Well, and Vince has proved he's a crazy old bastard, because that directive came right from him.
Yeah.
It didn't come from Hunter. It didn't come from Jerry McDevitt, his lawyer. It came from him.
Yep.
From the office of Vincent J. McMahon, Vincent K. McMahon. That came from him.
Yep.
Vincent J., by the way, was his father, Vincent James McMahon. People, they call him Junior. No, but it's actually not. He's not actually not a junior,
Yeah.
Vincent Kennedy McMahon, a singular individual.
Yeah, and most people and they still say Vince Senior, and that's not true either.
Yeah. No. But even the old timers, it's funny. Like Dominic goes, the old guy, not the one now, the old guy.
Yeah.
Anyway, I tell you what, we had a great time tonight.
Great show.
Dan, what's going on in the world of our social media? Tell everybody where they can find us. And
obviously watching us on YouTube. We're on Twitter at Wrestling Future. That's no G, Wrestling Future. We have the Instagram at Wrestling with the Future, and that's got our schedules and pictures and upcoming events and that's definitely a place to look. We obviously both, Angelo and myself, are on Twitter, and we've got a lot of stuff coming up. We touched on it. We got a lot of side channels and great shows. So keep an eye on the YouTube page. And we continue. You mentioned earlier the views on Podbay, just Podbay, but we're on more than several hundred podcasts.
God.
At this point, anywhere you want to find a podcast, you're going to find.
We're there.
So yeah,
we. You know what's funny? Occasionally I'll do this. I'll just type in our name and start searching.
Right.
We are on. I didn't even know this was a thing. We are on a platform called Owl. What's it called? Owl. Hold on, I'm going to tell you here in just a second. It's called Pod Owl. It's called Pod Owl. Have you ever heard of it?
Heard of that? No.
Pod Owl.
Well, there you go. Plug for Pod Owl. They picked us up.
Yeah, and it's an owl. It's their logo is an owl.
Right.
Yeah, Pod Owl. Like, really? No shit. And we're on a shitload more. I mean, God, every time I turn around, we're on more stations. It's crazy.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? Oh, I wanted to ask you, where is the refs roundtable? People are asking me, where's the roundtable at?
Well, we've had, obviously I was out of town previously, and I've had quite a busy schedule, but we do have some stuff in the works. One of my usual panelists, and obviously you've noticed there's been no promo either. Jason, we wish him the best. He's going through some personal family issues, and everything. But it's in the works. I'm trying not to dodge it, but outside of the podcast, I've been averaging almost 80 hours a week working, so things have been a little crazy.
Well, they occasionally they take Dan out of his secured bunker from his undisclosed location,
right?
And let him come out and see sunlight. And once in a while, they give him real food to eat. Not that K-ration stuff, but he's got a lot going on. I put a lot on this kid, but he's young. He can handle it.
Right.
You can handle it. You got it.
Oh, man.
You got this, kid. You got it.
Man, you
mentioned Jason. Let's serious for a second. Jason is going through a bunch of stuff. Jason won't be back. We are going to cut a promo until I find a new host. Jason's welcome back anytime he wants to come back if he feels that he can do it. I'm not going to push him to come back, so I'm just going to replace him. And if he decides he wants to come back, then he'll be welcomed back.
Absolutely.
We have the refs roundtable. We have cut a promo. We have Life Lessons, which is our show. It will not be Life Lessons with Mike Messier. Mike Messier is no longer part of our platform or our podcast. We wish him well. But we do own Life Lessons, Wrestling with the Future's Life Lessons. And so we're looking for a host for Life Lessons. If you're interested, submit your bio to Dan the Man Sebastiano at @TheMan_WWTF. That's at @TheMan_WWTF on Twitter. Am I right?
Yes, and I can also be reached email at theman.wwtf@outlook.com.
There you go. So send your stuff to Dan, and he will vet you. Because I'm far too important to do that shit. Daniel, until next time, my friend, take care.
Yes, sir.
And you guys out there, happy wrestling, everybody. We'll see you next time.